John and Rhonda and Gail and Jerry have all done a beautiful job in these past weeks of sharing with you how they moved from being bystanders to activists. If you listen to them, the first three explained they don't see themselves as activists unless it simply means to take action on something. I've been curious that while they think of me as an activist without any hesitation, they don't think of themselves that way. I realized in my listening to each one that it might be helpful for me to share my story of how I moved on the activist spectrum. The churches I served in my first three calls might not have ever used the word activist to describe me. Maybe I haven't been an activist all along. It's possible there are times and places and even seasons, we would say, and people that catalyze for us how we are called to live and to work in the world. There are very few people who become activists overnight or because of one event or one person. Often, seeds are planted that grow over time, and then there comes a day when the idea or the passion or the protest flowers. My own journey is much more like that than a single influence or force. Jerry Mead mentioned something that happened when she was young that she knew wasn't right. And that recognition over time grew into something that propelled her toward feminism and the feminist movement. Let's start by defining some terms. A bystander is a person who is present at an event or an incident, but doesn't take part. Someone who is present but is not involved and chooses not to be involved. Some of the synonyms for this are observer, eyewitness, spectator, so those of us who attend sporting events, onlooker. An activist is a person who campaigns to bring about social or political change. Some synonyms for this are reformer, demonstrator, advocate, protester, radical, extremist. No wonder the word activist is one that many are uncomfortable using as an identifier. Did you ever campaign for something when you were in elementary school? I tried to get my Christian elementary school to stop requiring girls to wear dresses every Friday. I hated dresses. I was unsuccessful in my campaign, so I stayed home from school on Fridays whenever my mom would let me, which was way too often. If you have ever helped pass out flyers for a political candidate or register people to vote, you would be considered an activist. Just speaking up for something or against something that was said means you might be an activist of sorts. You've moved off of your onlooker, spectator, or observer spot and chosen to get involved in something social or political. While you may not identify as an activist, you might qualify as one. If bystander to activist is a spectrum, there are many stops along the way that we can identify with words like ally, accomplice, change agent. We're not just talking about an either-or description here. You aren't either a bystander or an activist because many of us inhabit different roles in different situations. Next, I think it's helpful to look at how nature and nurture impact our movement. 2 weeks ago, Rhonda mentioned in her story that I identify as an 8 on the Enneagram and that she is not an 8. So many of you might not be familiar with the Enneagram. I haven't been familiar with it for long because, like many of you, I grew up with the Myers-Briggs personality test. The fact that I am an 8 on the Enneagram is important for this story about how I moved from bystander to activist. I was born into a family of non-churchgoers. My dad soured on religion because of his Missouri Synod Lutheran parents, and my mom soured on it because she was Catholic and divorced. I don't remember any political conversations around the dinner table. No one in my family was engaged in service of any kind. We were all told we'd go to college and be successful, meaning financially successful. I was not nurtured to be an activist. I lived the first 7 years of my life in the wealthy suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, and then I lived the next 11 years of my life on a farm in a small farming community on the central coast of California. To say we were sheltered was an understatement. My nature, however, was a different story. I was the 4th out of 6 kids, and from the time I was young, I could not abide when people or animals were mistreated. My younger sister wore glasses from the time she was 2, and when we rode the bus to school, kids were teasing her, and I remember threatening to beat the kids up if they kept teasing her, and I meant it. I started confronting my mom about her alcoholism when I was 12. When I was in 7th grade, a new kid at our Christian school tried to sell pot to my classmates, and I turned him in because I knew it was wrong, and I didn't want my classmates to go down what seemed like a dangerous path. When I was in high school, I was visiting my dad and stepmom in New York City, and I went to Macy's on 34th Street by myself. It was enormous and so busy. Remember, I lived in the country in a town of 6,000 people. There were more than 6,000 in Macy's that day. I saw a mom yelling at her kid and dragging him by the arm, and without even thinking, I walked right up to her and told her to stop yelling and hurting her kid. Someone stopped and told me I should get out of there as fast as I could. Apparently, getting involved in that kind of thing in New York City was not a good idea. The list of my interventions involving total strangers is quite long. That is part of what it means to be an 8 on the Enneagram. There is something innate in me that cannot tolerate harm or abuse or bullying or violence. Last Sunday morning before church, I called the police because 4 men with a baseball bat were trying to bash in my neighbor's door. I gave the police my name. I was completely shaken by the whole thing, but I cannot stand by when I hear or see something. That is important to know about me in my own story about becoming an activist. There are 3 pivotal events. There are so many events, but 3 that I want to share this morning that moved me to becoming involved in being a social and political activist. The first was during my junior year of college when I spent a semester studying in San Francisco on the urban program. The year was 1984, and I was a student at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, a small private liberal arts college. Small private Christian liberal arts college. The program was structured for us to be in class 2 days a week and doing an internship 3 days a week. My internship was doing clinical pastoral education, which meant chaplain training at a Catholic hospital on the cancer ward. At age 20, I was in training to help people die and come to grips with their terminal illnesses. For the classes 2 days a week, we studied what was going on in Central America with the death squads and disappearances and the US involvement in all of it. We studied apartheid in South Africa. We studied the gay rights movement and what was going on with the AIDS epidemic, since we were living in the city that was the epicenter. Did I mention the college I went to, Westmont College, was quite conservative? To say this semester blew my mind is to grossly understate it. I had no idea what was happening in the world, and suddenly I not only knew some of it, but I was being asked to examine the US role in all of it. Most of my religious and political assumptions were turned upside down. As part of our study, the professors invited people in to tell their personal stories. Remember, this is pre-internet. We didn't have access to information other than in the books that we had and in meeting people face to face. One of the people who came was a man from El Salvador who I will never forget, though I don't know his name because he couldn't use his real name for safety reasons. He was a physician in El Salvador when he was kidnapped and tortured. He showed us some of the scars on his body from the torture. By some miracle, he escaped and then began the treacherous journey out of El Salvador and through Central America and across the border in Mexico. He was in San Francisco without documentation, and he lived in daily fear of being deported. His training and education were nothing without papers, so he was cleaning bathrooms for a living and getting paid under the table. I was devastated by his story and by the ways our own government had created what had happened to him. Someone asked him what we could do, and his response was crystal clear. Get involved politically and make sure your government stops training people in El Salvador to kidnap and torture people. He planted a seed in me that has been growing ever since, and one of the reasons I am an activist in the area of immigration. The fact that we are hosting and supporting families seeking asylum is in part because of this man who was willing to share his story with a bunch of privileged, white, private college kids. One of the patients I met during my internship was a Black woman named Gertrude, who was living with cancer and then found out it had become terminal for her. I visited her multiple times in the hospital, and she would tell me stories from her life. To this day, I don't know if it was because I was white or so young, or because of the way I asked her questions and responded, but during one of our visits, she told me I needed to learn how the world was. She told me her story of living in New Orleans as a young married woman and what happened when she was ready to deliver her first baby. Labor progressed more quickly than she or her husband anticipated, and she had to be rushed to the hospital. When she got there, the Black doctor was not there, and none of the white doctors would treat her despite the urgency of her condition. She described being left out in the hallway of the emergency department and begging for help. It wasn't until the Black doctor arrived and delivered her baby that she could eventually relax. But her life and her baby's life had been in jeopardy, and no white doctor would help. She told me that's when she and her husband made the decision to move to San Francisco. And though what she called the prejudice was better in San Francisco, it was still present. But at least she knew if she had a medical emergency, she would have a much better chance of being treated and not die on a gurney in the hallway. I had never heard such a personal and horrific story from a Black person before she told me this story. Almost 40 years later, I remember her name, her voice, her story, her courage. It was not her job to school me, but by being willing, she planted seeds in me that have been growing ever since. There were many other seeds planted that semester that are a significant part of who I am as an activist today. The second pivotal event was in August of 1988. I had finished 2 years of seminary and graduated with my master's in Christian education. I had already started a job at a church near Princeton Seminary as their director of Christian education. I was on staff with the senior pastor and the associate pastor. The associate pastor was a woman named Reverend Jean Southard. Jean was in her 40s, and I was in my 20s. She was the first woman pastor I ever worked with, and only the third one I knew in the Presbyterian church at that time. She seemed like a radical to me. She was divorced after her husband came out as gay, and she was still friends with him. She had adopted some biracial children. One of her daughters was a lesbian, and Jean seemed happy about her daughter, and she wore Birkenstocks. From my still conservative vantage point, Jean was as radical as you could get, and she was a great pastor. Though we had only known each other for a few months, Jean invited me to go to Washington, D.C. with her to participate in the 25th anniversary of the March on Washington. I had no idea, really, what she was inviting me to, but I said yes because I loved the idea of a road trip with Jean and a couple of others. I was also intrigued. I knew a little about the March on Washington, and I knew I wanted to be there to celebrate the 25th anniversary. We talked a lot on the way down to DC from New Jersey about the first March on Washington, and Jean educated me about so much that had happened in the past 25 years. It was embarrassing how little I knew. And when I think about it now, I realize that none of the churches I had been a part of in my life up to that point had ever talked about it or preached about it, had never talked about racism or preached about it, and justice was not a word I heard in those churches. Instead, I had been taught about my sin, how I could be forgiven, how afraid of God I should be, how obedient I should be, and how disciplined I was required to be in spending daily time with God. Though I had finished the 2-year program at Princeton, I did not take classes that focused on justice issues. When we arrived in DC, we spent the night with someone Jean knew, and then rose early on the morning of August 27th, 1988. We made our way to the Washington Memorial, and I had never been in a crowd or seen a crowd that big. There were close to 250,000 people, and everywhere I looked was a sea of faces of all different races and ethnicities and origin. I had never participated in a march or a protest before, and I was not prepared for what this march would be like. Interestingly, I don't remember much about what was said that day or even who was there. What I remember most was the feeling of energy and electricity and power in the crowd. There were people from across the rainbow spectrum of race marching and making demands and calling for a better world together. I had never seen or heard anything like it before. The program lasted for 3 or 4 hours after we arrived at the Lincoln Memorial, and I was surrounded by people I had never seen before, and yet I felt deeply connected to every single one when we sang songs and cheered and clapped and hushed. To say I was inspired can't really describe what happened to me that day. It took me many years after this seed was sown to educate myself, to find my voice, and to stop being a bystander when I was witness to racist people, comments, policies, and actions. The third pivotal event is actually 2 events that I've meshed into one. When I was serving a church in Columbia, South Carolina from 1993 to 1995, I went to a Presbyterian meeting where we were considering the issue of gay ordination in the church. The Presbytery had invited a young woman who was an Army chaplain who was seeking ordination in the Presbyterian church to come and share her coming out story. I was still unsure of where I stood on what I would have said then was the gay issue, because so much of my spiritual formation was anti-gay. I could accept gay people. This is how the rhetoric goes. I just wasn't sure if they could be Christian or not. And that was how I was taught to approach it all. But when this young woman got up and shared her story, she was incredible. She described how much she loved Jesus and talked about her life in the church growing up. And then she told the story of falling in love with a woman, and it was crystal clear to me that she was indeed a Christian. After she finished sharing why she felt called to ministry, I was convinced she should be ordained. I think some seeds had already been planted in me, and she provided just the right nutrients to make those seeds sprout all at once. When I left that church and the presbytery, I went to the Presbytery of the Redwoods in the San Francisco Bay Area. Lo and behold, it happened to be the presbytery where Jane Addams Sparr was a minister member. I had heard all about Janie, and up to that point, I vacillated between those who thought Janie was good for the church and those who thought Janie was trying to tear the church apart. I had heard all sides, but I had never met the woman. We laugh now about meeting each other at the Presbytery meeting where I was examined for that call. We had such wrong ideas about each other. Meeting Janie Sparr and hearing her speak before Presbytery was one of the most important events in my life as a pastor. I wouldn't be here today at Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church if I had not met Janie Sparr. And I was ready to meet her because in South Carolina, a young woman mustered her courage and told her coming out story in front of a bunch of Southern Presbyterians while they then discussed whether she should be allowed to seek ordination. Imagine the courage. Despite meeting Janie in 1995, it was another 4 years until I came out, and more years after that until I found my spiritual, emotional, theological, and social ground for being an activist. While conflict and confrontation might be innate for me related to harm, becoming an activist was a long, slow path of becoming honest with myself and then with others, and then being willing to risk everything. I did not have enough spiritual depth in my younger years to be an activist because I was living in a Christian world that demanded binaries. But because of the seeds planted by the man from El Salvador, whose name I will never know, by Gertrude, by Reverend Jean Southard, and the hundreds of thousands of others in Washington for that march, and by this young Army chaplain and Janie Sparr, I have, over time, found my way to this place of justice with love, working for the good of the whole, living an authentic life, and as much as I am able, being the hands and feet and heart and eyes and ears of Jesus in this world. When Jesus asked the character in Mark that we know as blind Bartimaeus what he wanted Jesus to do for him, Bartimaeus asked for sight. We can only imagine that Bartimaeus deeply believed that being able to see would result in great freedom for him. We each answer that question differently, depending on what we think will make us free. Freedom for me is being able to use the gifts, some that I was born with and some that I've cultivated, in order to help others become free. I pray constantly for just the right balance of rage and hope and discernment and being able to prioritize. I cannot help everyone who needs help, and I cannot involve myself in every justice issue. You may not call yourselves activists, and maybe you really aren't. But what we share in common are the pivotal events and people in our lives that resulted in seeds being sown deep inside of us. Even if you aren't an activist or you don't identify as an activist, surely you want to be free. And surely you want others to be free as well. So how do you answer the question, what do you want Jesus to do for you that will help you get there? Amen.